I really probably shouldn't be making a video right now because 1, I have a sore throat, and 2, I should be packing because I'm going home for Christmas in a few days. But a big part of my packing is probably gonna be to take home these books, or at least the ones that I've read. So I thought I'd do a video in front of them before they all disappear. This year for me has definitely been the year I've got back into reading. The year isn't even over yet and I've already read more books this year so far than in the last 3 years combined. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that for a bit. Because you know that tip that everyone says where if you want to read more, just put aside like 10-15 minutes every day and read? It works, funnily enough, because that's pretty much what I did. In January, I moved further away from university, so I started having to get the bus in and out every day. And I just started reading on the bus, and I've read so many books because of that. And even though I'm now at a different university and living on campus, so I can walk in every day, I've managed to keep the momentum going and keep reading a lot more than I was before the start of this year, so I'm really proud of that. But my reading habits have changed since I moved here. Like I said at the start of the year, I was reading about 20 minutes twice a day on the bus there and back to uni. So I was literally reading pretty much every day, and that kind of kept the momentum going as well when I got home from university, is sometimes I would be like, no, I need to finish this chapter or this book. But now I've got out of the habit of reading daily, I would say. I don't tend to read every evening, say, which is when I probably would be reading. Instead, I've been reading a lot more on a weekend. And that's more because I've dropped some of my hobbies since I moved here. So that was the first tip that I would have for trying to read more, is force yourself to read every day for even just 15 minutes or something. The second tip is maybe try rereading something that you really, really loved. For example, near the start of the year, I decided that I was going to reread the Harry Potter series because I hadn't done it in a while. And I think that definitely helped in trying to make reading a habit again, because it wasn't trying to force myself to read something new that I wasn't sure if I was necessarily interested in, like with reading new books. It was obviously very familiar, so it was coming back to something that I already knew that I was going to enjoy. And I am a fan of rereading in general. I don't think it's like, oh dear, I'm in a reading slump, therefore I have to reread a series that I loved. I think just occasionally rereading books that you really enjoyed is a good thing. For example, in the summer I read A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which I really, really loved and would 100% recommend to anyone who's a fan of sci-fi, particularly anyone who loves Firefly. But as I said, I loved that story so much and I kept thinking about it after I'd read it, to the point where I kind of got sick of not being in the middle of that story anymore and reread it again. If you don't feel like you want to really commit to rereading a long book, then why not try short stories? Another thing I kind of reread this year was Neil Gaiman's Emma's for Magic short story collection, in that I think all the short stories in there were ones that I'd read previously, so rereading those again felt familiar and comforting. And you don't have to read an entire collection, you can just read 1 or 2 short stories that you know that you enjoy. Something else that's good about rereading is that Goodreads now supports it. So I use Goodreads to keep track of everything I read, which has been especially useful this year, and the fact that it can now count rereads properly is definitely a bonus. If you're working towards a challenge, you don't feel like you're wasting your time rereading a book that won't count towards that challenge. Not that I think that getting obsessed over that kind of thing is a good thing at all. But tip number 3 is that for me, it did really help me push myself this year to keep reading more and more. Even when I hit my first reading challenge goal, I kept upping it. I upped it about 5 times this year, I think, just to keep kind of trying to beat that goal. It's a bit like gamifying it in a way. So clearly gamifying is something that works with my brain. I'm not planning on upping my reading goal anymore this year. It's currently set to 80 and I have currently read 85 books, so I've achieved my current goal. My 4th tip for getting back into reading is maybe try a different type of book, which is the best way that I could think of expressing what I'm trying to say. For example, audiobooks are something that you can listen to while you're doing something else. I tend to listen to podcasts when I'm doing something else rather than audiobooks because I feel like they're the sort of things where if I miss a bit, it doesn't really matter. Whereas if I miss a bit of a book because I'm concentrating too hard, then I'm potentially getting lost in the story. I tend to do that, listen to a podcast while I'm working, say, which means that it's very easy to get absorbed in what I'm doing. But if you're trying to listen to an audiobook, say when you're on a long walk or driving, then it might be slightly easier to stay concentrated on the book and the story. Or try graphic novels, which, as you can see behind me, I read V for Vendetta and I started reading The Sandman this year. I think The Sandman especially is a good example because it's written by Neil Gaiman, so I've already read a lot of things by Neil Gaiman and know that I like him as an author, so it wasn't quite as jumping into the unknown as it might be with starting with another graphic novel series, say like The Walking Dead. And as a side note, would 100% recommend The Sandman. It's a bit weird, but if you've already read some of Neil Gaiman's stuff, then you might kind of expect that. Maybe look it up before you start reading it, because there are some quite disturbing bits, but would recommend overall. Another example for graphic novels is the Doctor Who graphic novels. As you might know if you've seen some of my videos before, I'm a big Doctor Who fan. So similarly, starting with a character that I already know and love is a good way to get into a new type of reading. Those were the 4 tips that I had planned, but as I've been thinking about it, I would say that maybe tip 4.5 would be to switch it up as you're reading. Like if you've just read a graphic novel, maybe go back to a novel. If you've just read sci-fi, maybe try romance. That's been a concept that I hadn't really thought of, but really hit me this year because I realised at some point that I was really sick of reading about teenage boys, because I read a couple of Patrick Ness books. I started rereading the Gone series by Michael Grant. I also read Armada by Ernest Cline. There were probably a few more, but it got to a point where I suddenly had this realisation of, oh, I've read a lot of books about teenage boys recently. I think I'm sick of that. So I switched to something completely different and read The Sun Is Also a Star, which is a romance novel by Nicola Yoon and very much not my go-to genre of books. But I actually really enjoyed it because it was such a nice change from what I had been reading. And I also bought Nicola Yoon's other book, Everything Everything, which is still on the shelf behind me. And yes, Turtles All the Way Down is lurking on the shelf behind me, and I really enjoyed that too. But reading those books, which were set in the real world and about teenage girls, were definitely enough of a change from what I had been reading to feel like a breath of fresh air. Or rather, to help me feel like I wasn't reading the same story over and over again, because if you read a lot of books in the same genre, centered on a similar protagonist, you can feel a bit samey. You start to pick up only on the similarities and like the major plot points and cliches and tropes that after a while start to wear. And that's something that I hadn't consciously thought of until this year, when I had that moment of just, I need to read something different. So that's my 4.5 tips for getting back into reading if you feel like you're struggling a bit. As for what I'm currently reading, I'm halfway through Hunger by Michael Grant, which is the 2nd book in the Gone series that I mentioned earlier that I started in the summer. I also started The Fever Code, which is on the shelf behind me and is the 5th book in the Maze Runner series. I say 5th because it's a prequel, but you have to read it after you've read the Maze Runner trilogy, so I haven't really gotten into that yet, but I've only read the first few chapters, and so far it's very different to the Maze Runner trilogy, so it wasn't what I was expecting. And I'm also reading the new Night Vale novel, which is also behind me, called It Devours, and I'm really, really loving it. I really love the world of Night Vale. It Devours is about a female scientist who has only recently moved to Night Vale, which is a really, really nice way of seeing the town, which is very different to the podcast and also different to the first book. If you want to check out my Goodreads, the link will be in the description below, as will some of my other social media sites. If you want to add me as a friend on Goodreads, you're welcome to, but probably message me maybe somewhere else beforehand so that I know who you are. And that's it for this video, so hopefully look out for more reading themed videos in the future if I manage to keep up the habit into next year. And TTFN! I've managed to